Everything you just said then, you could swap the word Greece to the word UK, and it's almost as if you're describing the UK now.
Governments that are working in precisely the most destructive way drift throughout Europe to a culture of outsourcing responsibility to the state.
It's in their interest to have division because then they're seen as the protector of that group. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's amazing guest is a gentleman you would have heard of. You would have seen his face many times, probably more than you've seen me. It's Stellios Background from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. How are you doing, Stelios?
Hello, everyone. I'm really well, Nick, and I'm very glad to be joining you in your show. Thank you very much for the invitation.
No, you're welcome. I've been seeing quite a lot you've been putting on X, and that's why I contacted you. I thought I need to speak to Stelios. I've not spoken to you it must be about a year and a half, 2 years since I've been to the studio, and I thought I need to have a chat with Stelios. Let's get him on my podcast. Yeah, absolutely.
About time.
Let's start this off by, first of all, most people will know that you are not from these islands because of your accent and because of your name. It's just taken me 5 minutes to learn how to pronounce your surname. So I know that's not a British name. Where you from? What was your journey getting here? How did you get here? And how did you end up at the Lotus Eaters, which is the number one podcast news, I reckon, in the country?
Right. So I am from Greece. I was born in Athens and I spent there my first 22 years. And then I came to England to study. I studied economics and philosophy. And I'm here since 2013. 23 years, sorry. First 23 years in Greece. So I came here in 2013 and I'm here ever since. And I studied and worked in a university. I was at the University of York. And I was teaching philosophy for about 6 years. And I started encountering woke culture. And one of the main problems I saw was that essentially there was no way we could actually fulfill what they told us we should. So most universities are competing with each other for funding by the government, and they can't win Oxford and Cambridge, that is. And one of the main indexes they're competing with each other about is student satisfaction. And student satisfaction in woke culture means make everyone happy. So I quickly saw that the way to make everyone happy was essentially being a doormat. And I'm not a doormat, and I don't think it's good to have educators who are doormats, because if you say some things that are pro-trans, you're gonna frustrate the TERFs. If you say some things that are pro-TERF, you're gonna you're going to frustrate the trans crowd. If you say nothing, you're gonna be committing violence, because within quotation marks, I don't believe in this, but that's the view of the institution. Silence is violence. So there's really no way in which you can win, and especially if you come from particular groups, or unless you're a member of some groups that are very much favored by the left, you are entirely subjected to the arbitrary whim of the bureaucracy that governs academia. So I was looking at this, and I was very much angered by it. And I was very passionate about my subject, and I really wanted to find an outlet to speak about my ideas into the wider public. And that's how I came across the Lotus Eaters. And I'm very grateful for Carl and his outlet, because we are simultaneously talking about contemporary affairs while also having a more intellectual side occasionally. And I think we're doing a good job of knowing when to unleash each face of ours. I think so. That's how I came across the Lotus Eaters. It gave me the opportunity to actually communicate my ideas in a way that academia couldn't allow me to.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, absolutely spot on. Let's jump back to university. A friend of mine who spent years working in the university sector says the mistake they've made is at the moment university treats students as customers, where 20 years ago students were the product. They were the product of the university. They came out with more knowledge, more skills, and they were employable in the private public sector. Now it's just 4 years of, are you happy? Is there anything we can do for you? Can we make the courses easier for you? Don't worry if you can't do this. It's all about keeping those students, because every student is worth £9,000 a year. So they just become customers, not the product.
You're absolutely correct. And the problem and the implication there is that the customer is always right. So the student is always right, which creates several problems when students disagree with each other, and we are called to mediate between them. And yes, when you tell students that they are customers and the customer is always right, they're particularly resistant to being told to think more correctly. And there's no other way of me saying this, but philosophy is all about frustrating people and telling them that they don't know, and start introducing them to different modes of thinking that are a bit more critical and more substantial. At least they're leading to more substantial outcomes. And you kind of have to have the support of the university as an institution and of the department most specifically, because this is supposed to be a tiring process. It's not supposed to be a process that is a merry one. It's very challenging and very how should I put it? It's not a happy experience. So if the university is supposed to give students happiness, it doesn't teach them anymore. And we have a whole culture where standards are dropping or plummeting.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't say universities are giving students happiness. I would say universities are selling students happiness at £9,000 a year. And you could get a lot, you could be a lot more happier if you kept that £9,000 yourself and did things with it. That would make you happier. Now, yeah, you just said you're from Greece, so I'm presuming you still keep up to date with what's going on in your home country. When I think of Greece, I think of three or four things. I think of ancient Greece, an amazing civilization that was the beginning of the development of Western Europe, of the Western world. I think about my summer holiday, because going to Greek islands is my number one go-to when I go away every year. I'm about to book another Greek islands. I've not got a passport yet. I'm having trouble trying to get a passport, but when I get a passport, I'll be booking a Greek island for September. I love the Greek islands. But then I also think about the economy of Greece, what you went through when you were bailed out, and the disaster that was, all because you joined. Well, I think it's because you joined the euro, but I'm not that knowledgeable on it. And then more recently, I think about Greece as the staging post, like Italy, of the invasion of Western Europe by illegal migrants. So let's forget about the Greek islands. They're beautiful. Let's forget about Greek civilization. That's in the history books. It's amazing. Let's talk about, first of all, the economy. Has Greece recovered, or is Greece still really struggling?
Well, I think that it may be too charitable to call it a recovery. Along some indexes, there may be progress, but there are several concerns I have, for instance, and lots of other economists have, with respect to how this recovery has been achieved. I think that let me just give you a small contextual factors in it. I think that yes, to some extent, you can say that Greece joining the euro was something that was bad for Greece, because it restricted our monetary autonomy. And but that said, I think that we have sort of the same problem with Argentina, because there is no culture ever since the beginning of the 80s. There is no culture of fiscal and monetary responsibility. Most people have been accustomed and sort of trained into thinking of the state as the sort of middleman in everything. And they are accustomed into thinking that the best way to get anything done is to basically just print money. So in one respect, it was a bad thing because it restrained us with respect to printing more money. But on the other hand, that there was a positive side to it, because at the moment there is nothing that suggests that this statist culture has died. So if we were monetarily autonomous, fiscally autonomous, more autonomous, let's say, more, that's the better way of putting it. I don't know if we would have just the same problem with inflation Argentina had right before Milei. So that's one major thing. Now, fast forward 30 years onwards, 2010, 2011, we had the major Greek crisis, and we had the problem with we were about to default on our debt. And that's when a whole bad period started in Greece, very turbulent period. I'm of the opinion that almost 100% of the fault is Greek fault. It's our fault because it's primarily cultural. Ever since the early 80s, people have been infested with this statist ideology, according to which according to which everything should be mediated by the state, and the state knows best. And they want to essentially use the state as leverage for personal economic benefit. So there's a misconception and a stereotype that Greeks don't work. On average, we work, I think, more than most Europeans. The problem is we have some very bad structures that take advantage of how family-oriented we are. So what happens is that we have a very large private sector. Up until recently, you couldn't be fired if you were a civil employee, a state employee, which meant that there was basically no initiative or incentive for you to do your job. And what happened is that you have lots of people who, for family reasons, were bribed by the government with jobs for some family members of them. And when I say family, I don't mean just the core family, I mean also the extended family, in exchange for political support. So that's how the game is played ever since the 80s. You have parties with a very inflated public sector who essentially promise voters jobs in the public sector in exchange for political support. And that's essentially what is ruining the country. So there are some indications that the current government is trying to somehow mitigate this. I'm very skeptical. The mandate they got in 2019 was a reformist mandate, but I think that they are moving at a very slow pace. In some cases, we don't see them as being particularly willing to disturb statism. And I'd say that the main problem is that right now within the EU, there is, I think, there are several policies from within the EU that try to involve central planning and say, for instance, no, Greece, you're going to produce X, Y, and Z. Italy, you're going to produce, A, B, and C. And they try to do this, which harms right now our agricultural sector. And we are suffering from a kind of Dutch disease in economics, which is the over-reliance on one sector for the entire economy, which is tourism.
Everything you just said then, you could swap the word Greece to the word UK, and it's almost as if you're describing the UK now. Is that happening? Are we just a couple of decades behind Greece? Because that's what's happening. I know for a fact lots and lots of our public sector jobs are created, A, to reduce unemployment, even those jobs are not needed, We prioritize ethnic minorities, we prioritize DEI, we prioritize, all these minorities for those jobs. It says that on the job applications, you'll get an interview if you are a minority. We seem to be relying, I think we're turning into a semi-socialist state in the UK. The state has to get involved in everything. They even feed our children now at school, for breakfast, when that should be parental responsibility. And the state keeps taking more and more responsibility. And as someone who spent a decade working for the state, I've seen the incompetence. I've seen the way they work. They don't care. They don't care about the jobs. They don't care about me and you. They don't care about the country. And we're giving them more and more power and more control over us. I think we're replicating Greece.
Yes, to a very large extent, I see the same pathologies and the same pathogenies, let's say. And I think that there are some really good things about the UK that are not present in Greece. For instance, UK law is particularly helpful for doing business. The way that Greece operates isn't particularly helpful in this, because what you want as an investor or what you want as an economic agent, someone who is going to invest in your country or in a foreign country, is a degree of stability, at least as far as the state is concerned. You don't want, for instance, tax rates to change 30 times per 4 years, or every time that the PM of the country wakes up and decides to raise tax rates. Or you want a legal system where if you are going to engage in lawfare, you know that there is going to be a court ruling fairly soon, as opposed to 15, 20 years down the line. Because there are because, for instance, Greece is incredibly litigious as a society. But to speak about what you said about the semi-socialist state, I think that to a very large extent that this is true. And there is a tradition, I think, very strong in Europe of seeing the state as a sort of necessary mediator at everything. And I think that this is why we ultimately see so many efforts by the government to engage in social engineering. And I think that in what you said, implied in what you said, lies a phenomenon or a practice, which is, I think we can describe as outsourcing of responsibility from individuals and civil society to the state. And that's where, and the more we accept this and the more we go down this line, the more our culture and UK culture and European culture and you could say Greek culture becomes infested with governments that are working in precisely the most destructive way, in trying to tell people, I'm going to satisfy your immediate anger. Now, obviously, there are different sides. Some people may be justifiably angry and be completely unheard of. But, for instance, now Labour seems to placate its base. It's not a particularly big base, I'd say, because from my impression is that people who voted for Labour last year were mostly voting for an anti-Tory government. So I do think that there is a sort of drift throughout Europe to a culture of outsourcing responsibility to the state. The very idea of hate speech is precisely something like this. It's like we are not going to function as civil society anymore. We're not going to engage in public discussion as private individuals, citizens, or, call it how you want. We are not going to engage in public discussion as people with civil freedoms, let's say, if you don't want to talk about political ones. And we're not going to try to understand what's going on, try to criticize the government, try to, within a reasonable manner, marginalize people we think particularly problematic, all of it is being outsourced into the state. And the state wants to create subjects as opposed to having citizens that it is accountable to. That's why they're trying to penalize any criticism of their agenda. And I think that this is disastrous. Europe is becoming an economic pariah. The whole world is trying to go forward. Europe is just so much into its bubble of protectionism and overregulation, which is strangling this. And if we went back to meritocracy, I don't think we would see the same raid against the state and society that we see now. Because I think that what we are suffering at the moment is a combination of open border policy and massive economic welfarism, procurement of social benefits, mostly to people who don't work.
Yes. Two things jump out there at me. The first thing is you said addressing immediate anger. That, for me, is something I talk about, and I call it short-termism. That's about politicians who know, I mean, to fix our social problems, to fix many problems, takes a long time. They're very complicated, and it may take 1 or 2 decades to fix a problem. But politicians say to themselves, I'm going to get no credit out of this because it's going to take 2 decades. I need some credit now because I'm up for election next year. So I need a short-term bounce in the polls. I need some short-term PR. I've had politicians say to me when I worked at Manchester Council, and I worked in the crime team, so I was all about reducing antisocial behaviour. And I had politicians say to me, Nick, can you reduce antisocial behaviour in my area in the next year because I'm up for election next year? And I'd go, in a year, no. Oh, could you make it look like you're reducing antisocial behaviour? I said, I can make it look like I am, but I'll waste all my budget doing it, but there'll be no benefits. And the answer was always, do that because there's a benefit to me politically. So we would pretend to solve problems rather than doing the harder work of actually solving the problems. And I think in the UK, across the West, it's this short-termism, only looking at what the politician can get out of it in the short term rather than planning for the long term and solving problems forever. I think that's a huge problem.
Absolutely. And short-termism is a guarantee for disaster, because we are locked into a politics where we just look at, first, second, third, fourth quarter of the economy, and instead of tackling actual problems, we're looking at whether there was 0.7% increase or 0.6% increase of the GDP, never asking how this is distributed per capita, which often means less money for people. It's exactly what you said. There are lots of individuals engaged in politics who are very much interested in a short-term way of thinking and acting because they want to create the appearance that they are doing something. And I think that this is particularly, this sadly, it seems to be essential to the state, because it seems to me that there are many politicians who try to engage in this campaign, and especially when they can't create the appearance that you mentioned, they have to invent a whole different bubble, to invent different problems, and sometimes create them in order to appear as the solution to them, in order to appear as doing something. So, for instance, I heard that in West Yorkshire, there was a focus on saying that hate crime has been reduced. And the hate crime, and most of the victims of hate crime were policemen, according to some reports and sources. I think there were several articles that wrote about it. So we have the state right now, the leftist state, the woke state that has created all these problems, suddenly, all the woke hysteria and mania. And they have said, look at all these problems, and we are doing something about it. Look at how much we restrict people's civil freedom. when they're criticizing it. That's how they are doing this. So weird as it may sound, I'd much rather we had boring politicians who just said 0.6 or 0.7 GDP increase instead of focusing on the what hair color isn't represented in movies, and how we should restrict people's freedom away, and how we should ensure a sort of representation of our favorite groups within business, and how we should procure economic benefits to them.
Going back to hate crime, I want to raise these 2 points. The first thing is that the government talking about hate crime and other individuals talking about hate crime, they put themselves as the savior for that community. I'm here to look after you. If you're a Muslim group, if you're a female group, if you're an immigrant group, I'm trying to clamp down on hate crime because I'm here to protect you. You need me, so you best vote for me. It's in their interest to have division because then they're seen as the protector of that group. Now, I think it's gone beyond that now in our country with the politicians. I think that's how it started. But I'm beginning to think they've realized that they've created a problem they can't control, which is the balkanization of the UK. So the reason why they're coming down heavier now on hate crime, non-crime incidents, all these things, community tension, community cohesion, is because I think they've begun to realize that they need to control the people more, because if they don't, there will be urban violence, and because of split us all into groups, and now we see each other as a group. And if we look at each other as a group, that's basically looking at them as the enemy. Because if my group win, I will get more resources, I will get more money. So we've set groups up against each other in this country, and it's a balkanization. Hence why the government now is coming down hard on people, because it's all about trying to avoid the violence that they think is coming.
Unfortunately, I think you're correct. And it's a very sad thing that is happening. It's very dangerous and particularly disastrous, I'd say, is the right word. And I really think that the responsibility for solving it burdens the government's shoulders. And let me tie all of the things I took from what you said before, because I think what we frequently don't talk about is culture. And when I say we don't talk about, I don't mean you and I or us at the podcast. We talk about culture very much. I'm talking about the general public discussion. It doesn't focus in culture in the right way. Now, let me say two things. You mentioned hate crime in the beginning. And I think that this is particularly important because they are selling the lie that empowerment means outsourcing the responsibility for being protected psychologically from the state against whoever offends you. Now, protection against physical harm is something we all want. That's what the state should be about. What has happened and what has been the loophole that the current left has taken advantage of is they have inserted psychological harm into the mix. And they said, yeah, the state needs to protect people from harm, but you guys don't have a sufficiently good understanding of harm. Harm also involves psychological components. And for instance, being offended is a case of harm. That's how they are using it from a legalistic, conceptual language game angle in order to appear in public discussion as more palatable than they are, and more friendly to society at large than they are. So that's the problem, that there is a sort of insistence on saying, you're my population, you're my natives, and I'm gonna empower you by protecting you from psychological harm. That's what they say. But actually they split the population in two, and they're saying that actually it's one half that oppresses the other. And then we have third party groups that are being introduced into the mix, and many times in a very arbitrary fashion. So yeah, I mean, I don't believe that most people who apply for asylum come from war zones. Let's say I'm very skeptical about this. I think many more people apply for asylum than people who are actually eligible for asylum. Many more. But let's get to this. I think that this is a huge area where current governments and the governments of the last decades throughout Europe have actually failed their population. Democratically, the problem with the issue as far as democracy is concerned, and by the way, I'm generally speaking pro-democracy. I think that most of our problems come from governments not honoring their promises and not listening to their people. And actually neglecting the idea that democracy needs a demos, and you actually need to listen to the demos as opposed to demonize it and try to change it artificially, which is what current European states are trying to do. Whether inadvertently or consciously, that's another discussion. But in practice, this is what's going on. So what we see is the state, democratically speaking, we're voting once every 4 or 5 years for an overall agenda. It's more than conceivable that lots of people, for instance, are against the border policies of this or that government, but vote for it because they think that all the other alternatives are going to be even more disastrous. Now, that gives a facade of legitimacy to anyone who happens to be the government to say that we are going to proceed with our insane border policy. And, these are our values. We need to basically feed the entire world that's in trouble. That's how they do it. And you voted for it. The answer is no, the people didn't vote for it. You can't infer from people voting once every 4 or 5 years about an overall agenda to people supporting a particular policy of that agenda, especially when that policy is common in both agendas, in agendas of other parties. So I think what happens here is a particularly disastrous mix. It's a powder keg that is being developed, and I think balkanization is the best way of putting it. And it's creating a problem where there are increased social tensions. It's penalization of people who criticize it as purveyors of hate speech. And there's this idea that the state is going to mediate this social tension. But the fallacy that most statists and bureaucrats make is that they think that their plans are uniquely safe from backfiring. The question is, what if you're wrong? What if you actually find out that lots of members of your government can't actually take the steps necessary to mediate in a substantial way social tension? What if your MPs who are elected in a particular district or province are backed by the votes of people who are resisting a particular kind of crackdown or strong policing? All these are questions that are not entering in the minds of lots of politicians, or at least they're too scared to say it.
I agree. Stelios, we only got 2 more minutes left, but I'd like to discuss that another time with you about what you've said there. I could throw a million questions at you there. Let's end with this, which is basically, I think one of our problems is our politicians have come to the conclusion that they're our overlords, they're our rulers. And I'm still adamant they're our public servants. Stelios, you got 20 seconds, 30 seconds left.
Yes. So there's a huge tradition in the West, the last 3-4 centuries of talking and focusing on freedoms and liberties. Bureaucrats want to tell us that these liberties are essentially granted at their permission. We should insist that they're not.
Yes, exactly. And the Americans call it God-given. Yeah, excellent. Stelios, thank you so much for coming on. Thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. And let's do this again, because I want to get back into those social tensions and the incompetence of politicians who don't see their own flaws, and the unintended consequences are always worse than them of the problem they're trying to fix. We see that all the time.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you. Bye bye.